We're in Isaiah, the 10th chapter, and would be starting verse 15 tonight. But the context goes back to verse 5 and goes through verse 19. And I've given the title of this section, Assyria shall be judged. That he is pointing out that Assyria is God's tool in destroying Israel. They are referred to by God as a hypocritical nation. But Assyria, because of their pride and their intent to destroy Jerusalem, when God's done with them, then God's going to punish or destroy them. And in this entire section, we keep learning that God is the one who is, in reality, He's the one in control. So that's the dealing with the entire section, really. But verse 15, he says, shall the axe boast itself against him that heweth therewith? Or shall the saw magnify itself against him that shaketh it? As if the rod shall shake itself against them that lift it up? Or as if the staff should lift up itself as if there were no wood? In this, Isaiah is using four figures. Each of them are in reality being to show the point that Assyria is being used to carry out his purpose. The first, the axe boasting itself against the hewer, the one who uses the axe. The second, the saw against the one who saws with it. As King James puts it, shakes it. So here's the one who's using the saw. The saw is going to boast itself or against the one who's using it. The third is the rod against the one who lifts it. And again, shake itself against them that lift it up. And then the fourth figure, the staff lifting itself up as if there is no wood. So these four figures that God uses to set forth, I'm in control. I'm using Assyria to punish first the northern kingdom of Israel, then the southern kingdom of Judah. Even though they're not going to be able to take Jerusalem, but yet God's the one using them to punish His people. So in verse 16, therefore shall the Lord of hosts, send among His fat ones leanness, and under His glory He shall kindle a burning like the burning of a fire. What are we told, and probably all of you remember, about the word therefore? It's a conclusion. You go back to what has been said. This is the result now. You look at all that has been said. This is a direct result. And really what he has been discussing is Assyria's pride. Even in the last verse, and God is showing Assyria is being used by God to carry out His purpose, but here they are, as he says, boasting against the one who's using it. He's using them, but they're boasting against Him. So the entire section, all of this is dealing with Assyria's pride. And so he reminds everyone, shall the Lord of hosts. What does the Lord of hosts, or the word host, have reference to?
Lord of armies.
Okay, armies. The Lord of armies. And so here, our God is a God of armies, or of the armies. And now then he is going to use various figures to illustrate the type of plagues that God is going to bring upon Assyria. The first is the figure of, here's the choicest soldiers. The idea of his fat ones. That's the very best soldiers that they have. And they're going to suddenly waste away to nothingness, as if they were struck by a grave illness. And so here, the fat ones, leanness. That's going to be the result. God is sending a plague upon the Assyrians because of their pride. And here's their strongest, most virile soldiers. And now then they're wasting away to having no strength and just to nothingness. The next, all the things of their glory, the things that Assyria glories and prides itself in. Well, what were some of those things? Their power. They were a powerful nation. You remember all of the discussions in relationship to Assyria. Look at what I'm going to do. I've destroyed this nation. I've destroyed that nation. And that shows that our gods are better than their gods, and you can't do anything against us. Their power, their wealth, because they had taken all these nations, they've taken all of the wealth out of those nations and taken it back home. Well, he says, here's all of the things they glory in. It's going to be like having a fire built under it and thus burned up, destroyed, left in ashes, like the burning of a fire. Probably all of you know and have seen the destruction that comes as a result of fires. I remember when I worked as a volunteer fireman for a few years, and the destruction that would come as a result of it. We tried to get there as fast as we could in order to put out the fires because of the destructive nature of them. And so here's the destructive nature that God is going to bring upon Assyria, to where it's left in ashes. In verse 17 then, the light of Israel shall be for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame, and it shall burn and devour his thorns and his briars in one day. It says the light of Israel. Who's he talking about? Okay, it would be God, wouldn't it? Turn over to Isaiah 60 and verse 19. And there Isaiah says that the sun shall be no more thy light by day, neither for brightness shall the moon give light unto thee, but the Lord shall be unto thee an everlasting light, and thy God thy glory. So God is an everlasting light. Well, the light of Israel thus is God. And I guess if we wanted to, we could go through the book of John and just think back as you've read the book of John, how many times the idea of Christ being the light of the world. Well, here's the light of Israel, God. He's going to be like a flaming fire, is what Isaiah is saying. Turn over to Deuteronomy 4 and verse 24. And someone read that. Deuteronomy 4 and verse 24.
The Lord thy God is a consuming fire, even a jealous God.
Okay. Here's God is a consuming fire. Hebrews, the 12th chapter and verse 29 says basically the same thing. For our God is a consuming fire. And as we've made the point in years gone by, that even as God is love, and that deals with the character or the nature of God himself, the same type construction is our God is a consuming fire. And so both aspects of the nature of God is seen in the Scriptures. Remember what Paul wrote in Romans 11 and verse 22. Paul talked about that a little bit Sunday morning. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. The two natures of God. Now, a lot of people today don't want to hear about that aspect of the severity of God. They just want to hear about the goodness of God. That God is love, and because God's love, what we hear today, because God is such a loving God, he would never send anyone to hell. But yet that's exactly what the Scriptures teach. If God is not a consuming fire, then God's not love either. If there's no severity of God, there's no goodness of God. You cannot have one without the other. Now, in taking this to the situation that Isaiah is speaking of specifically here, here's the nation of Israel, divided now to the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, but they were still the nation of Israel, as far as they were God's chosen people. They had committed sin. They are wickedness. Thus, God was going to punish them. They were going to receive the severity of God. Why? Because of their sin. God was going to use, and this now is dealing with a physical aspect, God was going to use the Assyrians in order to accomplish this punishment. By the way, he does spare Jerusalem, doesn't he? If you remember how, 185,000 men died in one night. And as we jokingly put it, they woke up dead. God spared Jerusalem. There's the goodness of God. But now then, he's going to destroy Assyria, now that he's used them to punish Jerusalem. Why? Well, because of their pride, because of their arrogance, their wealth, and the wickedness that they had done. Study the book of Habakkuk sometime. And if we live long enough, we'll get there. Well, probably none of us will live that long. So, Habakkuk's a great book, though. that's dealing with the very subject, he's asking a question. He is in a dilemma. Here's a holy God. And yes, Israel was not what it should be. They are sinful. But now then, God is going to use, this holy, righteous God is going to use a nation that's in reality more wicked than Israel. How can that be? How can God use, and if you want to put on a moral scale, here's God at the very top. There's no immorality, no sin whatsoever with God. And then you have Israel, and then you have these other nations. And God's going to use these other nations that are more wicked to punish one that's less wicked. And Habakkuk is saying, how can God do that? And that's the question to God. Now, then, if you want to make some application to today, why is it that all of these people out here that are so seemingly rich in this world's goods, they seem to have no cares, no concerns whatsoever, and yet they persecute Christians, they do all of this evil, and here we are struggling with all of these things that we have to deal with on a daily basis? Now, why isn't everything a bed of roses for us, in effect? That's the same principle that what Habakkuk was dealing with, and the same thing that Isaiah is dealing with here, except he's not questioning God. God's saying, I'm going to use them, but I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to use them to punish someone who's not as wicked as they are, but I'm going to destroy them too. And so I'm going to destroy them. It shall burn and devour his thorns and his briars in one day. Now then, would not state that is a literal statement of one day, although you could look at that 185,000 that died in one night and say, well, to a great extent, they were destroyed at that time. But he's indicating by the idea of one day that's something that happens quickly. It's going to be very sudden. It's not going to be over a long, long period of time, of years or decades or something like that. God is going to take care of them quickly, in a quick manner. So in verse 18, and shall consume the glory of his forest and of his fruitful field, both soul and body, and they shall be as when a standard bearer fainteth. This is showing or continuing to show, really, the extent of the destruction, with the glory of his forest and his fruitful field being Sennacherib's army in this case. In Isaiah chapter 37 and verse 24, mentions, by thy servants thou hast reproached the Lord, and hast said, by the multitude of my chariots am I come up to the height of the mountains of the sides of Lebanon, and I will cut down the tall cedars thereof, and the choice fir trees thereof, and I will enter into the height of his border, and the forest of his Carmel. Now then, that's dealing with these servants of Assyria who are reproaching God. And so I'm going to climb up cut down the tall cedars, the choice fir trees. I'm going to enter into the height of his border, the forest of his Carmel. Why? Because they're boasting against God. And if you go back into Isaiah 37 and the surrounding chapters, you'll see that here's Rabshakeh, who has been sent by Sennacherib, and he's telling Jerusalem, give up, because your God cannot deliver you. Your God can't do anything, and Hezekiah can't do anything against us, because we're so strong and so powerful. Our men are so mighty. Even if we gave you all of these things, gave you chariots and horses, you still couldn't even defeat anyone.
He in fact used undignified profanity. You take time to read the nuts and bolts of the chapter.
He does. He basically is cursing God and God's power. So here's the glory of his fruitful field, or the glory of his forest, the fruitful field. Well, that's dealing with Sennacherib's army and how Sennacherib viewed his army. Soul and body would represent the entire man being destroyed. Now then, just as a quick aside, and not to try to go into a great deal of detail and depth in regards to this, sometimes we refer to spirit, soul, and body, sometimes soul and body, sometimes spirit and body. What's the difference? Well, that's a good question. Let's move on now. Understand that the terms spirit and soul many times are used interchangeably. Sometimes there are times in which all three are delineated. The body obviously deals with the physical. The spirit would be the eternal nature of man that God has placed within man. Soul, when used in all three of them being used, would deal with that, what I heard a long time ago described as life force, and I like that terminology. God breathed into man's nostrils a breath of life. Man became a living soul. It's that life force that which gives the body life. So that would be the three aspects. When just the two are used, as here, soul and body, it's dealing with that, basically the entire person as being used here. The entire being, the entire man. Now then, that is a brief overview. And Dale, you wanted to...
Well, insert some contrast. The spirit shall return to God who gave it, Ecclesiastes 12, and then spirit, the one that can destroy both soul and body in hell. So spirit and soul are kind of like confused, but a lot of people's mind is they don't know enough references.
Well, I said soul and body many times are used interchangeably, dealing with the same aspect. Sometimes it's referred to as soul, sometimes spirit. Context is going to determine. When Solomon in Ecclesiastes says the spirit shall return to God who gave it, he's dealing with that eternal nature of man, that spirit of man that God has placed within man. that will continue to live throughout eternity. When Jesus is referring to fear that one who's able to destroy both soul and body, he's dealing with the exact same thing. Except he refers to it as soul there as opposed to Solomon's using spirit. Same thing, no difference. So they're used interchangeably a lot of times. There are those occasions where spirit, soul, and body are used in which you make that distinction between the three. But other times, context is going to determine whether he's dealing with that in using the three terms, the life force of man, soul, or that spirit that's going to live throughout eternity, as to which one is being used and how it's being used. But here, soul and body, Isaiah just using it as the entire man is going to be destroyed. When it says, and they shall be as when a standard bearer fainteth, the idea is that here's a sick man that is wasting away. The nation is lying prostrate, similar to one who's fainted. He's passed out. He's there, lying there flat. That's the nation now of Assyria that God has used to punish the Israelites. And then in verse 19, and the rest of the trees of his forest shall be few, that a child may write them. Again, going back to that trees of the forest, Sennacherib's army, and he says the rest of them, well, the majority of them is dead now. But those who might have escaped the destruction are going to be so few that a child could count them. So here's a once huge army that has been reduced to almost nothingness. Now then, we've referenced it a couple of times, but that does remind us of that night in which God destroyed 185,000 of Sennacherib's army. How big was his army before that? Don't know. But think of 185,000 people or soldiers who die overnight. That's by itself a huge army, isn't it? And yet there's still others who did not die, but they have been reduced to such a size that what does Sennacherib do? He went home. He fled, flew away. No, he fled. Just retreats back home. Anybody remember what happened to him then? He was killed by his sons, two of his sons. And then a third son takes over for him. Those two sons flee. But turn over to 2 Kings 19. And in verses 32 through verse 36 of 2 Kings 19, it says, Therefore, thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, He shall not come into this city, this city being Jerusalem, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord, for I will defend this city to save it, for mine own sake, and for my servant David's sake. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And that's where we got that. When they woke up, they were all dead corpses. They were all dead. Idea. That's that few, so few that a child could count them or write them, as it put in here in Isaiah 10:19, that remained out of those 100, and then the 185,000 killed by the angel of the Lord. That's also basically repeated in Isaiah chapter 37, verse 36 and 37. It talks about, then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 145,000, and when they rose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt in Nineveh. By the way, if you read those two chapters, they're almost word for word exact. There's 3 chapters in 2 Kings and in Isaiah that are that way. Just word for word exact. There you have the fulfillment of what Isaiah is talking about in relationship to the Assyrians. Now then, in verses 20 through verse 23, the return of a faithful remnant is how I titled this section. The return of a faithful remnant. Verse 20, and it shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel, and such as are escaped of the house of Jacob, shall no more again stay upon him that smote them, but shall stay upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. There's a small group, a remnant. That's what a remnant is, a small group who escaped the destruction at the hands of the Assyrians. And while, as we read through or gone through chapter 10, you see Assyria coming down in this from the north, and they're destroying all of these cities and getting closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem. And when they encircle Jerusalem, that's when the 185,000 die and he flees. But the rest of the land basically is desolate now. Sennacherib has destroyed it. So there's a small remnant left, though, who have escaped the hands of Sennacherib. Certainly Jerusalem would have been in that small number. But what Isaiah is saying here is that they've learned their lesson. Not to trust and lean upon heathen nations and political power. Instead, these few, this remnant, will have learned to place their trust in God, who is their strength. invariably, when a nation comes upon the Jerusalem or the southern kingdom, you're going to see people start placing their trust in other nations. Especially when you're dealing with the Assyrians, also the Babylonians later. They always want to run down to Egypt and get help from Egypt. And in fact, Rabshakeh, when he's talking to the people on the wall in Jerusalem, he says, if you think you can go down to Egypt and get help, they're not going to be able to help you either. And so he makes the clear distinction. They can't help. And yet, that's the nature of those who lived at that time. Let's go to get help from these other nations. Remember, as we were talking about in chapter 7, here's these two nations, and they're wanting Jerusalem to join with them to fight against the Assyrians. And when Jerusalem refuses, Ahab, they then say, well, let's fight against him and remove him, and we'll set up a vassal king who will join with us, and then all three of us can fight. What is it? We're going to get help to fight against these nations. That's the way in which they acted so many of the times. They placed their trust in political power or military power, military strength, instead of placing their trust upon God. Okay, Dale?
There's a verse, and I forget where it's at, but no man is saved by a mighty army or something other, some blah, 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 I forgot.
Blah, blah, blah.
It's a vain hope for him. I wish I knew where it was. It's really amazing chapter, and you probably know where it's at.
Well, there's several times in which that basic idea is set forth. Isaiah talks about it. Jeremiah does. There's a lot of them that mention that idea. To make an application, whether you're dealing with from a physical standpoint or a spiritual standpoint, we place our trust in God, not in other things. Problem is, a lot of times we don't place our trust in God. And as a result, we have difficulties, we have problems, because we're not placing our trust in God. Israel had trouble. If they had placed their trust in God from the very beginning and kept their faith in God, then would God have used the Assyrians to punish them? Well, of course not. God used the Assyrians to punish them because they had stopped placing their faith in God. I almost hate to mention it sometimes, but I hear, and sometimes it, well, I won't put it that way, but that we are a free nation because of our military. No, we're not. Or that our military is what keeps us free. No, it's not. God is. Now, I respect what the military does, and those who serve in the military certainly deserve our honor. But that's not what keeps America free. That's not what made it great. It's God that does that. God is the one who's in control today. And the way in which we're headed within our nation today, from a moral standpoint, God will end up destroying us. Doesn't matter how many warriors that we have, what type of armament that we possess, God will destroy us.
There was a time when they
Well, there was a time in which they did. They don't nowadays, though.
They do not, and that's why it's important that the people that do have that authority, or, you know, at least conversation on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that hardly anyone in our government nowadays has any respect for God or the things of God. It would be hard to find someone, I think, but there might be a small few. But that which is going to sustain us is righteousness. Remember the statement, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Okay, Dale, I know you got...
Just like the Lord used water, South Carolina, North Carolina, Babylon thought their army was so hot and tough, and they rerouted the Euphrates River and messed up that city. And water can be used, the Lord can use any number of things to bring people to their knees and cause them to be tempted to repent rather than stay hard-headed.
We don't know that God specifically uses anything today. Any natural disaster, we don't know if God's using that. God might be. He did it in the past. He could be doing it today. But to say that a natural disaster or something that happens today is God doing such, we don't know that. We do know that He uses things to bring about His desired will. And, okay, Dale. He used a lot of things. And yes, that was one of them. But will God do it today? Yes. Can we say that God did it? A specific action today? No. That gets into the very aspect of the providence of God even. Do we know that God works in providential ways? Absolutely. Can we say anything today is the providence of God? No. Now, and how do I know that? Read the book of Philemon. Even an inspired writer of the Bible, writing by the inspiration of God, had to say, perhaps Onesimus ran away so that he could be converted to Christ. And now then being sent back to you, not as one that was worthless, but now then one who is profitable to you. Perhaps, though. So even he could not, as an inspired writer, say, this is the providence of God. So, same principle would hold true. So, we'll stop there and pick up, Lord willing, next week with verse 20.